One of my biggest sewing regrets is when I bought my second sewing machine, the one after my first beginner sewing machine. It ended up not being as big of an upgrade as I hoped it would be, and I had to replace that machine much sooner than I initially hoped. So in today's video, I want to share a few tips on how to select your next intermediate sewing machine so that it feels like an upgrade and you can use it for years to come. Throughout the video, we're going to talk about different sewing machines through 4 different points, and I'm going to show you 3 Brother sewing machine models as an example. If you're wondering how do I have all these beautiful machines, it's because I'm partnering with Brother on today's video. I've been using Brother machines for over 2 years now, and I have sewn lots of different projects using different machines, so I know very well which functions to look at when you're choosing your next sewing machine. So let's begin with the first question you have to ask yourself is what type of sewing machine you want to have. So the first type of sewing machine I'm going to show is the computerized sewing machine. Now, if you're a sewing beginner and you have something similar to this mechanical J17S sewing machine, which has a few stitch options and has a single 4-step buttonhole, then computerized sewing machine with lots of stitch options would probably be the most popular choice. Now, compared to the mechanical machine, the computerized machine has a screen, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, that allows you to choose from a variety of different stitches. Compared to the beginner-friendly machine, the computerized machine will have far more stitches. The most important stitches, in my personal opinion, would be the amount of stretch stitches available, which will allow you to sew different knit fabrics, and also available buttonhole stitches, most likely which will be 1-step buttonhole stitches, which will feel like a massive upgrade from a 4-step buttonhole. Also, computerized machine will definitely have a few more extra functions, something of which we will talk a bit more later in the video. Not only that, but computerized machine will probably be a little bit bigger than your beginner-friendly machine. It will also be more powerful. It will have a stronger motor, which will allow you to sew through more complicated and more difficult to sew fabrics easier, and it will also be a little bit faster. Now, speaking about computerized sewing machines and how to know if this is the type of sewing machine for you, I think that this is an ideal option if you like to sew a variety of different projects. You like to sew decorative pieces, but you also work on garments. You like sewing woven fabrics, but you also like sewing knitwear. Now, because of how many stitches and how many functions computerized sewing machine has, it will allow you to sew through lots of different projects, and you will find necessary stitches in computerized sewing machine. But there are also a few other type of sewing machines that I want to show you. And the second type of sewing machine I want to show you today is the combination sewing machine. So it has everything a computerized sewing machine has, plus it can be converted into an embroidery machine. So instead of using sewing machine and having a standalone embroidery machine, you can get everything into one pack. Now, when combination machine is the best choice for you is if you want to add personalization details into your garments, into your decorative pieces, if you want to add that embroidery touch, but you don't want to have a separate standalone embroidery machine, then a combination machine may be the best option for you. So personally, this is what I currently use the most because I do like adding some embroidery details to my kids' garments. I like adding embroidery details to my own designs, but I don't use embroidery function so much that it would be worth for me having a separate standalone embroidery machine. And when everything is packed into one machine, it's far more convenient for me to just quickly switch it into embroidery mode whenever I need it. Now, when it comes to embroidery machines or combination machines, they vary very much in the price based on the size of the largest available hoop. Now, if I'm doing embroidery on my kids' clothes, I typically use a rather small hoop, so I don't need a large embroidery area. However, whenever I'm doing embroidery for my own designs, I typically choose a large design, and because of that, having a very big embroidery hoop is a big plus. So here again, if you want to have a combination machine, you also have to think about the largest needed embroidery area for your projects, and if you need a big one, or if you're okay with having a smaller one, and if it's totally enough for your projects. So we've seen the computerized machine and a combination machine, but now let me show you one more type of sewing machine. Now, third and final type of sewing machine I want to show you in today's video is the straight stitch only machine. As the name suggests, this sewing machine does only one type of stitch, the straight stitch, but it does it perfectly because it has lots of points on how to fine-tune the seam regardless of what fabric or material you're working with. These type of machines are very powerful, and some may call it as a semi-industrial sewing machines. Now, as a person who has sewn with industrial sewing machine for many years, I can tell you that this particular machine does feel very close to the industrial sewing machine. Now, I would say that this type of sewing machine is a good choice for you if you are sewing like 90% of your seams using a straight stitch, and you only need like maybe a buttonhole stitch, which you can use from your beginner sewing machine. Or if you have a serger, you can use it to knit on raw seam allowance or sew knit fabrics and then finish the garment using your straight stitch machine. Now, because the sewing machine has only one straight stitch option, you won't be able to create like buttonholes, or you won't be able to sew very stretchy fabrics using it. So back when I had the industrial sewing machine, I used that sewing machine to sew most of the garments, and I would use my serger, which is a different machine that cuts the fabric and finishes a raw seam allowance with a stretchy seam to sew knitwear or finish my raw edges. And I also kept my beginner sewing machine that I used whenever I needed buttonhole stitches or if I needed to sew with a twin needle. So this type of sewing machine is a great choice if you use only a straight stitch, then it's of course perfect solution. Or if you have a serger and if you keep your beginner friendly sewing machine and use that for like buttonholes or sewing with twin needle. If you switch from beginner sewing machine to the straight stitch sewing machine, it will definitely feel like a big massive upgrade regardless of what type of fabric you're going to sew. So these are all three types of sewing machines that I wanted to show you in today's video, and now let's move on to the second point, which is the size of the sewing machine. And speaking of size, if you have a permanent sewing space, meaning you don't have to move your sewing machine once you're finished sewing, then I have to say the bigger the better, for two main reasons. First of all, big sewing machine is also heavy. So if you're sewing with very difficult projects, with huge big projects, even if you're pushing machine really hard, you're not going to move the machine. It feels very stable. It is very stable on the table. And because of that, it gives you a very pleasant sewing experience. Not only that, but the second reason why size matters is because of this huge space right here. Let me show you how it compares to beginner size sewing machine. So this is a beginner sewing machine, and as you can see, the area here, the work area, is much smaller than the area on this huge XL size sewing machine. Now, why this matters? If you're working with big projects, think about quilts, think about coats, puffy jackets, then having a large area like this will allow you to very easily feed the fabric through the sewing machine, versus if you have a smaller sewing machine, you will have to find workarounds how to feed the whole project through the sewing machine. So if you have a permanent sewing space, you don't have to move your sewing machine, then the bigger is definitely the better. However, if you do not have a permanent sewing space, then I recommend looking into medium size options that still have the big, beautiful workspace, yet are more portable. And once you're done sewing, you can just pick it up and store it in the closet. So when it comes to the size, the bigger the better if you have a permanent sewing space, but if not, then look into more portable options that have a big sewing area. So once you have figured out the type of sewing machine that you need and the size of the sewing machine, next I recommend looking into stitches. Now, first and the most important stitch to look at is of course the straight stitch. Now here, my best tip, if you have a possibility, you want to go in the store and test the machine yourself just to feel how that straight stitch feels. Now, very often the machines are advertised based on how many layers of different fabrics you can sew with it, but from my personal experience, it's best to look not only how many layers it can sew, which typically shows how powerful the motor is, but also how well it handles shifting from several layers to multiple layers at seam connections. So this is definitely something that you want to go ahead and test in the store. Also, speaking about the straight stitch, if you're looking into the straight stitch machine, it will have lots of different features, how you can fine-tune the perfect settings of the straight stitch regardless of what type of fabric or material you're working with. It will have settings how to thread machine for lightweight or thicker thread. It will have different feed dog position for lightweight or heavyweight fabric, as well as you're going to be able to adjust the pressure of the presser foot. Also, another very interesting thing about straight stitch machines in particular is that they have a very narrow hole at the metal plate, which when you're working with very lightweight fabrics, prevents fabric from getting sucked into the metal plate. Now, this feature is also available in other computerized sewing machines, more advanced computerized sewing machines, and they will have the metal plates that you can easily switch. And when you're working with lightweight fabrics, you want to sew it with the straight stitch, you can very easily and simply switch the metal plate of the sewing machine into a straight stitch plate and achieve best results. So if you're using straight stitch in most of your projects, definitely look into what features the sewing machine has to truly create the perfect straight stitch, regardless of what fabric or material you're going to use it with. Now, speaking of other stitches that are important, it will very much depend on what projects you're going to work. Now, personally, I'm going to share which features and what stitches I personally use the most. So for me personally, after the straight stitch, it is very important that the sewing machine has a one-step buttonhole and preferably a few different shapes of buttonholes that I can choose from. For me, it's also important that sewing machine can sew with a twin needle because I sew lots of knit fabrics and I use twin needle to hem knit garments. Also, because I love sewing stretchy knit fabrics, I like to have several stretch stitches to choose from, especially overcast or straight stretch stitch. Now, personally, I don't use a lot of decorative stitches. I use it from time to time, so it's not as important for me. But if you're creating lots of decorative projects, if you like to add decorative stitches into your garments, the amount of available decorative stitches should also be something to look at. So here are all the stitches that are worth looking into. Again, the number one priority should be the quality of the straight stitch and how many functions the sewing machine has to really fine-tune and create the perfect straight stitch regardless of the material you're going to sew. But also pay attention on your specific projects and what specific stitches you're going to need in your next sewing machine. So now that we have talked about different stitches, the final thing I want you to think about is the other functions that you need in your sewing machine. The computerized machine especially, they have lots of different functions. I'm going to share the functions that I personally find the most useful and functions that improve my workflow, and because of that, I do consider them non-negotiable. So first and foremost function I definitely recommend having and looking in your next sewing machine is the auto thread cutting. This means that you can set your sewing machine that after the seam is finished, after it does the back stitches, it automatically trims the thread. Very useful function, and it's very easy to quickly get used to that. And whenever I switch to sewing machine that doesn't have the auto thread cutting, I immediately miss it. So for me, this is one of the functions I personally find non-negotiable. Another function that I find very useful is either the auto presser foot lift or knee lift. So if your sewing machine has the auto presser foot lift, this means that every time you stop the sewing machine, you can set the machine to automatically raise the presser foot. If your sewing machine has a knee lift, this means that whenever you want to lift the presser foot, you don't have to manually raise the presser foot using a handle, but instead you can use the knee to just push the lever and it will automatically raise the presser foot. Very useful function, especially if you're working with projects that have lots of details, lots of seams, and it may not seem as such a big important feature, but once you start using it, it's very convenient and it just speeds up the entire workflow a lot. Another feature to look at is the speed. Now, personally, whenever I'm sewing, I never sew at the maximum speed. However, if that is important for you, if you like sewing at max speed, then it's something to look at as well. However, speaking about speed, I want you to think about whether you need the speed adjustment, which means that you can set your sewing machine to sew at a certain speed. So regardless how much you're pushing the foot controller, it's not going to sew faster than the slowest setting or the fastest setting. Now, typically I use it set on the maximum speed. However, if I'm sewing very precise details, I like to set it on the slowest setting just in case, and I feel that it gives me more precision and more control over the seam that I'm sewing. The speed regulation is also very convenient if you're going to use your sewing machine not with a foot controller, but using a start-stop button. Now, personally, I'm going to admit this is not a function that I use often. I use it very rarely, and mostly I use it if my 4-year-old son asks to sew together, so I remove the foot controller and we sew using just start-stop button. However, I think that having this function is very useful if you don't want to or cannot use the foot controller. Then definitely look into the sewing machine that has a start-stop button. This will allow you to operate the machine without having to use your feet and navigate the foot controller. Another function that I truly like is the auto threading. This is available in more advanced sewing machines where you push one button and the machine self-threads the needle. Now, this is a feature again that once you have it, you can get used to it very quickly, and I do like to use it on my combination machine. I use it all the time. Now, this particular model right here does not have the auto threading, but it does have the threading function, which is much easier and more convenient. And again, you have to think about how many threads you're changing throughout the project, how many thread colors you're changing, and if having auto threading is important for you and your projects. And finally, another thing to think about is the ease of use, and more specifically the manuals, because very often you have a beautiful sewing machine, but if you do not have a good manual to follow with it, you won't be using the machine to the full potential. And here I definitely have to give credit to Brother, because they have huge, big manuals following every single of their machines, especially when it comes to computerized sewing machines. They cover literally every single function in depth with pictures, so it's very easy to get the most of your sewing machine. So if you're getting a sewing machine and it's a computerized sewing machine that has lots of functions, definitely take a look if they have a good manual to follow with that sewing machine so that you can know how to use your machine to its best potential. So here are all the tips I wanted to share in today's video, and hopefully now you have a better understanding what to look for in your second intermediate sewing machine. I have quite a few videos where I talk about different types of sewing machines, so if this is a topic you want to dig a bit deeper into, I'm going to link a few of those videos in the description box down below. If you have any questions about the machines you've seen in today's video, you can leave the comment in the comment section down below, and I will share some insights from my own experience of working with these machines. Thank you for joining me in today's video, and I will see you next time. Bye!